The dust from the banker's polished boots hadn't even settled on her porch when Julia Whitmore realized she had nothing left to offer except the clothes on her back and the land deed he'd come to collect. She stood in the doorway of the small ranch house her father had built with his own hands 15 years ago in 1867, watching Silas Crane fold his arms across his chest like a vulture preparing to feast on carrion. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've been more than patient with you," Silas said, his voice carrying that particular tone of false sympathy that made her stomach turn. 6 months past due on your mortgage payments. Your husband's death, tragic as it was, doesn't change the facts of business. Julia's fingers tightened on the doorframe. At 24 years old, she'd already buried a husband, lost a stillborn child, and watched her cattle sicken and die from a disease the veterinarian couldn't name. The small ranch outside Portland, Oregon, had been her sanctuary, the place where she'd imagined growing old with Thomas, raising children who would run through the pastures and learn to rope calves. Now it was just a collection of memories wrapped in timber and nails, and Silas Crane wanted to tear even that away from her. "I need more time," she said, hating how her voice wavered. "The spring calves will fetch good prices at market in 2 months. I can pay you then." Silas pulled out his pocket watch, checking it with exaggerated patience. "I've heard that before, 3 times if memory serves. No, Mrs. Whitmore, I'm afraid your time has run out. I'll be back tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp with the sheriff. You'll vacate the premises or you'll be forcibly removed. The choice is yours." He turned to leave, and Julia felt something break inside her chest, some final barrier between desperation and surrender. "Please," she called out, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "I'll do anything." "There must be something we can arrange." Silas paused, turning back with an expression that made her skin crawl. "Anything, Mrs. Whitmore. That's a dangerous word to use with a man like me." The implication hung in the air between them, thick and poisonous. Julia took a step back, her hand moving instinctively to the doorframe as if she could somehow disappear into the wood itself. Before she could respond, a voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk. "I believe the lady said she needed more time, Mr. Crane." "Seems to me a gentleman would oblige." Both Julia and Silas turned toward the voice. A man sat astride a paint horse at the edge of her property, and Julia wondered how she'd missed his approach. He was tall, she could tell, even mounted, with broad shoulders and sun-darkened skin that spoke of years working under the Oregon sky. His hat was pushed back just enough to reveal dark hair and eyes the color of weathered oak. "This is a private conversation, stranger," Silas said, his tone sharp. "I suggest you move along before you find yourself in trouble." The stranger dismounted with an easy grace, his boots hitting the dusty ground with barely a sound. As he walked closer, Julia could see he was perhaps 27 or 28, with a strong jaw and the kind of face that looked like it smiled easily, though at the moment his expression was hard as granite. "Benjamin Vaughn," he said, not offering his hand to Silas. "I've been working the Riverside Ranch about 10 miles north. Heard in town you've been making trouble for folks who have fallen on hard times." "Making trouble?" Silas's face flushed red. "I'm conducting legitimate business. This woman owes the bank $1,200, and she hasn't made a payment in 6 months. If you're so concerned about her welfare, perhaps you'd like to settle her debt yourself." Julia expected Benjamin to back down. $1,200 was more money than most cowboys saw in 2 years of hard work. She opened her mouth to tell him not to bother, that she'd handle this herself somehow, but Benjamin spoke first. How much to clear the debt entirely? The world seemed to tilt sideways. Julia grabbed the doorframe harder, certain she'd misheard. Silas's expression shifted from anger to surprise to calculating interest in the span of a heartbeat. $1,500 would clear the mortgage and the accumulated interest, Silas said slowly. But that's a substantial sum for a ranch hand. I'm not a ranch hand, Benjamin said. I own the Riverside Ranch, bought it 3 years ago after a successful cattle drive to Wyoming. I have the money. Julia found her voice. No, absolutely not. I don't even know you. I can't let you do this. Benjamin turned to look at her for the first time, really look at her, and Julia felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with desperation or fear. His eyes were kind, but there was steel beneath the kindness, the look of a man who'd made his decision and wouldn't be swayed. "Madam, I'm not asking your permission," he said gently. "Consider it an investment in good neighborliness." "I can't pay you back," Julia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have nothing. No money, no cattle worth selling, nothing." "Then don't pay me back," Benjamin said simply. He turned back to Silas. "I'll ride into town with you now and settle this at the bank. You'll provide Mrs. Whitmore with documentation showing the mortgage is satisfied in full." Silas's eyes gleamed with avarice. He clearly didn't care where the money came from, only that he was getting paid. "Very well, Mr. Vaughn, though I must say you're being remarkably foolish with your money." "My money, my choice," Benjamin said. "Let's get this done." They rode off together, leaving Julia standing on her porch feeling like she'd just witnessed something impossible. She sank down onto the steps, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. A stranger had just saved her home, her life, everything she had left of her father and her brief marriage to Thomas. And he'd asked for nothing in return. It made no sense. Men didn't do things like that, not in her experience. There had to be an angle, some expectation she'd be required to fulfill. The thought made her feel ill, but she pushed it aside. Whatever Benjamin Vaughn wanted from her, she'd deal with it when the time came. For now, she still had her home. 3 hours later, Benjamin returned alone. Julia had spent the intervening time pacing through her small house, alternating between relief, confusion, and a growing sense of obligation that sat heavy in her stomach. When she heard the sound of hoofbeats, she stepped out onto the porch, wiping her damp palms on her worn calico dress. Benjamin dismounted and pulled a folded document from his saddlebag. He approached the porch, but didn't climb the steps, maintaining a respectful distance that surprised her. "It's done," he said, holding out the papers. "Your mortgage is cleared. The bank has no further claim on your property." Julia took the documents with shaking hands. The official stamp of the Portland Bank and Trust was clearly visible, along with Silas Crane's signature confirming the debt was satisfied. She looked up at Benjamin, searching his face for some hint of what he expected from her. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this for a complete stranger?" Benjamin was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting past her to the house and the land beyond. "My mother was widowed when I was 15, he said finally. "She tried to run our farm in Missouri by herself, but it was too much. The bank took everything. We ended up living in a boarding house, and she worked herself to death taking in laundry and mending. She died when I was 17, still owing money for my father's funeral expenses." He looked back at Julia, and she saw old pain in his eyes, the kind that never fully healed but taught you things about the world and your place in it. "I swore if I ever had the means, I'd help someone in her situation," Benjamin continued. "I've been fortunate. The ranch is doing well, and I have more than enough to live on. $1,500 won't break me, but it might save you. That's reason enough." Julia felt tears prick her eyes, the first she'd allowed herself to shed since Thomas's death. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Benjamin said. "Just keep your land, make it prosper. That'll be thanks enough." He started to turn away, back toward his horse, and Julia felt a sudden panic at the thought of him leaving. "Wait," she called out. "At least let me offer you supper." "It's the least I can do." Benjamin hesitated, and Julia could see him weighing his options. Finally, he nodded. "That would be kind of you, madam. Thank you." "Julia," she said. "Please call me Julia." "Benjamin," he replied with a small smile, "though most folks call me Ben." She led him inside, suddenly conscious of how sparse and worn everything looked. The furniture was old, handmade by her father, and showing signs of hard use. The curtains were faded, and there were gaps in the floorboards she'd meant to have Thomas fix before he'd gotten sick with pneumonia last winter. But if Ben noticed or judged, he gave no sign. Julia busied herself preparing supper, grateful she'd shot a rabbit that morning and had fresh vegetables from her garden. As she cooked, Ben sat at the small kitchen table and they talked. At first, the conversation was careful, polite exchanges about the weather and the state of ranching in Oregon. But gradually, as the evening light faded to purple through the windows, they began to share more. Ben told her about growing up in Missouri, about the long cattle drive that had earned him enough money to buy the Riverside Ranch, about the slow process of building something from nearly nothing. Julia talked about her father, about meeting Thomas at a church social when she was 19, about the dreams they'd had for this place. "He was a good man," Julia said softly, placing plates of stewed rabbit and vegetables on the table. "But he wasn't a rancher, not really. He tried, God knows he tried, but he didn't have the instinct for it. We made mistake after mistake, and by the time we realized we were in over our heads, it was too late. Running a ranch is hard," Ben said. "Especially alone. What happened to your cattle?" Julia sat down across from him. "Black leg. Lost 30 head before we even knew what was happening. That was 4 months ago, right before Thomas took sick. I've got maybe 15 left, and they're in poor condition. I've been selling them off one by one just to buy food." Ben was quiet for a moment, then said, "I could help you rebuild your herd. I've got more cattle than I can properly manage on my own land. I could lend you some breeding stock, help you get back on your feet." Julia shook her head firmly. "No, you've already done too much. I can't be further in your debt." "It wouldn't be debt," Ben said. "Call it partnership. You've got good grazing land here, better than some of what I'm working with. We could share the spring calves, split them 50-50. That way we both benefit." It was a generous offer, far more generous than Julia deserved. She studied Ben's face, trying to understand what kind of man would give so much to a stranger. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked. "And please don't tell me it's just because of what happened to your mother." "There has to be more to it than that." Ben met her gaze steadily. "Maybe I'm lonely," he said simply. "The ranch keeps me busy, but it's not the same as having someone to talk to share meals with. Maybe I saw a woman in trouble and thought maybe we could help each other." "Is that so hard to believe?" "Yes," Julia wanted to say. In her experience, men always wanted something, always had expectations. But looking at Ben's open, honest face, she found herself wanting to trust him, wanting to believe that maybe, just maybe, there were still good people in the world. "I suppose we could try it," she said slowly. "A partnership, but I want it clear that I'm not looking for anything else. I'm not ready for that." Understanding flickered in Ben's eyes. "Of course. This is business, pure and simple, though I hope we might be friends as well." "Friends?" Julia repeated, testing the word. "Yes, I think I'd like that." They finished their meal, and Ben helped her clean up despite her protests. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "I'll bring some cattle over tomorrow, along with a young bull. And Julia, you're going to be all right. I promise you that." After he left, Julia stood on her porch and watched him ride away into the gathering darkness. For the first time in months, she felt something other than despair. It wasn't quite hope, not yet, but it was close. Over the following weeks, Ben became a regular presence on Julia's ranch. He arrived each morning just after dawn, bringing cattle as promised, helping repair fences and outbuildings that had fallen into disrepair. He worked with a quiet efficiency that Julia found herself admiring, and he never once made her feel like she was accepting charity. They fell into an easy routine. Julia would cook breakfast while Ben handled the morning chores, and they'd eat together before starting the day's work. He taught her things Thomas had never known, about rotating pastures and identifying sick animals before the whole herd got infected, about managing money and planning for lean seasons. Julia found herself looking forward to his arrivals, found herself listening for the sound of his horse in the early morning quiet. She told herself it was just gratitude, just appreciation for his help, but she knew she was lying. There was something about Ben that drew her, something beyond his obvious kindness and generosity. One morning in early May, about 6 weeks after Ben had first appeared at her ranch, they were working together to clear brush from a new pasture area. The day was warm, and Julia had tied her hair back with a ribbon, conscious of how she must look with dirt on her face and her old dress stained with sweat and grass. "You know," Ben said, pausing to wipe his forehead, "I've been thinking about what you said that first night. About not being ready for anything beyond friendship." Julia's heart stuttered in her chest. "Yes, I want you to know I respect that," Ben continued. "But I also want to be honest with you. I care about you, Julia, more than a friend should, probably. But I'm not going to push you or expect anything from you. I just thought you should know." Julia set down the brush she'd been clearing, her hands suddenly unsteady. "Ben, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Ben said quickly. "I'm not asking for a response. I just wanted you to know where I stand. If all we ever are is friends and business partners, that'll be enough for me. But if someday you might feel differently, I wanted you to know I'd be interested in exploring that." He picked up his tools and moved to another section of brush, leaving Julia standing there with her thoughts in turmoil. The truth was, she did feel differently. She'd been trying not to acknowledge it, trying to convince herself that the flutter in her stomach when Ben smiled was just gratitude, that the way she found herself watching him work was simple appreciation for his skill. But it was more than that. Somewhere in the past 6 weeks, she'd started falling for Benjamin Vaughn, this quiet, generous man who'd saved her home and asked for nothing in return. And that terrified her. That evening, after Ben had left for his own ranch, Julia sat on her porch and forced herself to think honestly about her feelings. She'd loved Thomas, truly she had, but it had been a gentle, comfortable love, the kind that grew from friendship and shared dreams. What she felt stirring in her heart for Ben was different, sharper, and more intense, like the difference between a candle flame and a wildfire. But was she ready? Thomas had been dead for 7 months. Was that long enough? What would people say if they knew she was developing feelings for another man so soon? Julia had always cared too much about propriety, about what others thought, and she hated that about herself. The following Sunday, Julia went into Portland for church services, something she'd been avoiding since Thomas's death. She needed to think, needed perspective, and being around other people sometimes helped. The service was the same as always, familiar hymns and a sermon about forgiveness that felt pointed given her recent thoughts. After the service, several women approached her with sympathetic expressions and veiled curiosity. News traveled fast in small communities, and everyone had heard about the mysterious rancher who'd paid off her mortgage. "Is it true Benjamin Vaughn cleared your debt?" Martha Henderson asked, her voice pitched just loud enough for others to overhear. "That must have been quite a relief for you, dear." The emphasis on the word quite carried implications Julia didn't miss. "Mr. Vaughn was very generous," she said carefully. "He's been a good neighbor." "I'm sure he has," Martha said with a knowing look. "A wealthy, unmarried man spending so much time at a young widow's ranch. People will talk, Julia." "Then let them talk," Julia said, surprising herself with the sharpness in her voice. "Mr. Vaughn has been nothing but respectful and kind. If people want to make something sordid out of basic human decency, that says more about them than it does about us." She walked away before Martha could respond, her cheeks burning but her head held high. As she climbed into her wagon for the ride home, she realized something important. She didn't care what people thought. For the first time in her life, she truly didn't care. Ben was waiting at her ranch when she arrived home, sitting on her porch steps with his hat in his hands. He stood when he saw her wagon approach, and Julia's heart did that strange flutter again. "I hope you don't mind me waiting," Ben said as she climbed down. "I wanted to talk to you about something." "Of course," Julia said, suddenly nervous. "Is everything all right?" Ben twisted his hat in his hands, a gesture so uncharacteristic of his usual confidence that Julia felt her anxiety spike. "I've been thinking about what I said yesterday," he began. "About caring for you. I'm worried I made you uncomfortable, and that's the last thing I wanted to do." "You didn't make me uncomfortable," Julia said softly. "You surprised me, but in a good way." Ben looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. "Julia, I know it hasn't been long since you lost your husband. I know people would say it's too soon, but I can't stop thinking about you. When I wake up in the morning, my first thought is whether I'll see you that day. When something good happens, you're the person I want to tell. And when I'm working alone at my ranch, all I can think about is finding an excuse to ride over here." Julia's breath caught in her throat. "Ben." "I'm not asking you to marry me," Ben said quickly. "I'm not even asking you to court me, not officially. I just want permission to care about you openly, to maybe take you into town for dinner sometimes, to sit with you in the evenings and talk. Just to spend time with you without pretending it's only about the ranch or the cattle." Julia thought about Martha Henderson's judgmental face, about propriety and waiting periods, and all the rules society said she should follow. Then she thought about Ben's kindness, about how he'd saved her home and asked nothing in return, about how he made her laugh and feel safe and cared for in a way she'd never experienced before. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'd like that very much." The smile that broke across Ben's face was like sunrise after a long, dark night. He took a step toward her, then stopped himself, maintaining that respectful distance he always kept. "May I take you to dinner next Saturday?" he asked formally. "You may," Julia said, feeling her own smile grow. "I'd be honored." The week that followed was the longest and shortest of Julia's life. She found herself counting down the hours until Saturday, then feeling foolish for being so excited about a simple dinner. She had almost nothing suitable to wear, her wardrobe consisting mostly of worn work dresses and one black morning dress she'd sewn after Thomas's death. On Friday evening, there was a knock at her door. Julia opened it to find Martha Henderson standing on her porch, of all people, holding a wrapped bundle. "Mrs. Henderson," Julia said, unable to hide her surprise. "What brings you here?" Martha had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I owe you an apology," she said. "What I said at church last Sunday was unkind and uncalled for. Benjamin Vaughn is a good man, and you deserve happiness after everything you've been through." Julia blinked, uncertain how to respond. Martha held out the bundle. "This was my daughter's dress. She's moved to California now and has no need for it. I thought perhaps you might like to have it. I understand Mr. Vaughn is taking you to dinner tomorrow." Julia unwrapped the bundle to reveal a beautiful blue dress, the color of summer sky, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. It was far nicer than anything she owned, and she felt her eyes fill with tears. "Mrs. Henderson, I can't accept this," she said. "Of course you can," Martha said briskly. "And please call me Martha. I've been a bitter old woman since my husband died, taking my unhappiness out on others. You reminded me last Sunday that there's still kindness in the world. Let me do this small thing to make amends." Julia looked at the dress, then at Martha's sincere expression. "Thank you," she said. "This means more than you know." After Martha left, Julia tried on the dress. It fit perfectly, hugging her waist and falling in graceful folds to her ankles. She looked at herself in the small mirror above her dresser and barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked young, pretty even, and for the first time in months, she felt like maybe she had a future worth looking forward to. Saturday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth. Ben appeared at her door precisely at 6 o'clock, wearing a clean shirt and vest, his dark hair neatly combed. When Julia opened the door, his expression of stunned appreciation made her blush. "You look beautiful," he said softly. "Thank you," Julia replied. "You look very handsome yourself." They rode into Portland in Ben's wagon, sitting close enough that Julia could feel the warmth of his arm next to hers. They talked easily about small things, about the ranch and the weather and the new general store that had opened on Main Street. But underneath the casual conversation, Julia felt an electric awareness of Ben's presence, of every small movement and gesture. The restaurant was the finest in Portland, an establishment called the Willamette House that Julia had never been able to afford. Ben held her chair for her and ordered wine with their meal, treating her with a gentlemanly courtesy that made her feel cherished and special. Over roasted chicken and vegetables, they talked more seriously than they ever had before. Ben told her about his dreams for his ranch, about possibly raising horses in addition to cattle. Julia shared her fear that she'd never be able to make her ranch truly profitable, that she'd always be barely scraping by. "You won't be scraping by," Ben said with confidence. "I've seen how hard you work, how quickly you learn. Give it another year and your ranch will be thriving. I'd stake my reputation on it." "You have a lot of faith in me," Julia said. "I do," Ben agreed. "Because I know who you are. You're strong, Julia, stronger than you give yourself credit for. You've survived things that would have broken most people and you're still standing. That takes real courage." Julia felt tears threatening again, but this time they were good tears, the kind that came from being truly seen and appreciated. "You make me want to be strong," she said. "You make me want to be the person you seem to think I am." Ben reached across the table and took her hand, the first time he'd truly touched her beyond helping her down from a wagon or passing her tools. His hand was warm and calloused from work, and Julia felt a thrill run through her at the contact. "You already are that person," he said. "You just needed someone to remind you." They lingered over dinner, neither wanting the evening to end. When Ben finally drove her home, the stars were out in full force, scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. He walked her to her door and paused there, making no move to leave. "I had a wonderful evening," Julia said. "Thank you for everything." "The pleasure was entirely mine," Ben said. He hesitated, then asked, "Julia, may I kiss you good night?" Julia's heart hammered in her chest. This was a line, a clear step from friendship into something more. If she said yes, there would be no going back to the comfortable neutrality they'd maintained. But looking at Ben's face in the moonlight, at the hope and tenderness in his eyes, she knew she didn't want to go back. "Yes," she whispered. Ben stepped closer, his hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. He moved slowly, giving her time to change her mind, and then his lips were on hers, soft and warm and perfect. The kiss was gentle, restrained, but Julia felt it all the way to her toes. When they finally pulled apart, she was breathless. "Good night, Julia," Ben said softly. "Good night, Ben," she replied. She watched him ride away, then went inside and leaned against the door, her fingers touching her lips where he'd kissed her. She was falling in love with Benjamin Vaughn. No, she corrected herself. She'd already fallen. The summer passed in a blur of work and growing affection. Ben continued helping Julia rebuild her ranch, but now their partnership had deepened into something more. They spent long evenings on her porch talking about everything and nothing, stealing kisses when the work was done, learning each other's hopes and fears and dreams. Julia learned that Ben liked his coffee black and strong, that he had a beautiful singing voice he was shy about sharing, that he'd once dreamed of being a doctor, before circumstances forced him to become a rancher instead. Ben learned that Julia could outshoot most men despite her small size, that she had a wicked sense of humor hidden beneath her proper exterior, that she cried at weddings but never at funerals. By August, Julia's herd had grown to 40 healthy cattle, and her pastures were green and well-maintained. The ranch that had been on the verge of ruin was now profitable again, showing promise of real prosperity. And Julia herself had transformed, the haunted, desperate woman of 6 months ago replaced by someone confident and happy. One evening in late August, as they sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Ben took her hand. "Julia, I need to ask you something," he said, his voice serious. Julia's heart skipped. "What is it?" "I love you," Ben said simply. "I think I've loved you since that first day when you stood up to Sela's crane with nothing but pride and determination. These past months with you have been the happiest of my life, and I can't imagine my future without you in it." He slipped off the porch step and knelt before her, pulling a small box from his pocket. "Julia Whitmore, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Julia looked at the ring in the box, a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the dying light. She thought about Thomas, about the guilt she'd expected to feel at this moment. But there was no guilt, only joy and love and a bone-deep certainty that this was right. "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Ben, I'll marry you." Ben slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her, a kiss full of promise and passion and love. When they finally broke apart, both were grinning like fools. "I was so nervous," Ben admitted. "I thought maybe you'd say it was too soon or that you weren't ready." "I'm ready," Julia said firmly. "I've been ready for weeks. I just didn't know it until now. You've given me so much, Ben. Not just my home and my livelihood, but hope and joy and a reason to look forward to tomorrow." "How could I not love you?" They set the wedding date for September 15th, giving themselves a month to prepare. Julia insisted on a simple ceremony at the church in Portland, nothing elaborate or expensive. Ben argued for something grander, wanting to give her a beautiful day, but Julia stood firm. "All I need is you," she told him. "Everything else is just decoration." The wedding day arrived with perfect autumn weather, cool and clear with leaves just beginning to turn gold on the trees. Julia wore the blue dress Martha Henderson had given her, with wildflowers in her hair that Ben had picked that morning. Ben wore his finest suit, looking handsome and nervous, and so full of love that Julia felt her heart might burst. The ceremony was attended by nearly everyone in Portland, the community turning out to witness the union of two people who'd found each other in the midst of hardship. Even Sela's crane appeared, looking vaguely uncomfortable but offering his congratulations nonetheless. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Ben kissed Julia with such tenderness that several women in the congregation wiped away tears. As they walked down the aisle together, hand in hand, Julia felt a profound sense of rightness, of coming home after a long journey through darkness. The reception was held at the Willamette House, the same restaurant where they'd had their first dinner together. Friends and neighbors celebrated with them, toasting their happiness and future prosperity. Martha Henderson presented them with a beautiful quilt she'd sewn herself, telling Julia quietly that she hoped it would keep them warm through many happy years together. As the sun set and the celebration began to wind down, Ben pulled Julia aside. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Julia said honestly. "You've given me everything, Ben. A home, a future, love. How do I ever repay that? You already have," Ben said, pulling her close. "You've given me someone to share my life with, someone to love and be loved by. That's worth more than all the money in the world." They spent their wedding night at Julia's ranch, which would now be their shared home until they decided what to do with Ben's property. As they lay together in the darkness, wrapped in each other's arms, Julia felt a peace she'd never known before. "I was so scared that day Silas came to take my ranch," she whispered. "I thought my life was over, that I had nothing left to live for. And now?" Ben asked, his hand stroking her hair gently. "Now I know that sometimes losing everything is just making room for something better," Julia said. "You saved me, Ben, not just my home, but me." "We saved each other," Ben corrected softly. "I was lonely and aimless before I met you. You gave me purpose, gave me a reason to build something lasting. We're a team, you and me, partners in every sense of the word." The months that followed their wedding were busy and productive. They decided to keep both ranches operating, with Ben managing the larger riverside property while Julia focused on her father's land. The two ranches complemented each other well, and together they became one of the most successful cattle operations in the Portland area. In March of 1883, Julia discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with equal parts joy and terror, memories of her stillborn child with Thomas haunting her. But Ben was unwavering in his support and confidence. "This time will be different," he told her, holding her close when her fears threatened to overwhelm her. "You're stronger now and you're not facing it alone. Whatever happens, we'll handle it together." Ben was right. Julia's pregnancy was healthy and uncomplicated, and on a crisp November morning, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Thomas Benjamin Vaughn, honoring both Julia's first husband and the man who'd become her greatest love. Holding her son for the first time, Julia felt the final piece of her healing click into place. She'd been broken, nearly destroyed, but she'd survived. More than survived, she'd thrived. And looking at Ben's face as he gazed at their son with wonder and love, she knew that her life had turned out better than any dream she'd once harbored. The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. Thomas grew into a strong, cheerful boy who loved the ranch and showed early promise as a horseman. 2 years after Thomas's birth, Julia gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, with her father's dark hair and her mother's determination. And 3 years after that came another son, William, who had Ben's easy smile and Julia's sharp mind. By 1890, the combined Vaughn ranches were among the most prosperous in Oregon. They employed several ranch hands and had expanded into horse breeding as Ben had once dreamed. Julia had proven herself to be as capable a rancher as any man, earning respect throughout the community for her business acumen and her skill with cattle. But more than the success of the ranches, it was the love that had grown between Julia and Ben that defined their lives. Even after years of marriage, they still sought each other's company, still found joy in simple conversations and shared sunsets. They'd built something rare and precious, a partnership of equals based on respect and genuine affection. One evening in the spring of 1891, as they sat on the porch of what they still called Julia's ranch, though it belonged equally to both of them, Ben took her hand. "You ever think about that day I first showed up here?" he asked. "When Silas was threatening to take your home?" "Sometimes," Julia said. "It feels like a lifetime ago, like it happened to someone else." "You had nothing left to give that cruel banker," Ben said softly. "I still remember how you looked, so proud despite being terrified. I knew right then that you were someone special." "I was desperate," Julia said. "If you hadn't come along when you did, I don't know what would have happened to me." "You would have survived," Ben said with certainty. "You would have found a way, but I'm grateful I got to be part of your survival, part of your triumph. You've made my life richer than I ever imagined possible." Julia leaned against him, watching their children play in the yard. Thomas was teaching Sarah to rope a fence post while William toddled around, getting in the way and laughing when his siblings pretended to lasso him too. "I used to think love had to be earned," Julia said thoughtfully. "That you had to be perfect or successful or have something valuable to offer before you deserved it. But you taught me that real love is freely given, no strings attached. You paid my debt and asked nothing back, and in doing so you gave me everything." "You gave me everything too," Ben said. "A family, a home, a reason to wake up smiling every morning. I'd pay that debt 1,000 times over for what we have now." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the sun set over their land. In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully, and the smell of coming spring filled the air. Inside the house, dinner was waiting, and later there would be stories and laughter and the comfortable rhythms of family life. Julia thought about the journey that had brought her here, about loss and desperation, and the moment when a stranger on a paint horse had ridden into her life and changed everything. She thought about how close she'd come to losing everything, and how that loss had somehow become the doorway to something better than she'd ever known. "I love you," she said to Ben, the words as true and necessary as breathing. "I love you too," Ben replied. "Forever." And in that moment, with the sun painting the sky in shades of gold and her family around her and the man she loved at her side, Julia knew that forever was a promise they would keep. She had started with nothing, had been stripped down to bare survival, but she had rebuilt her life into something beautiful and lasting. And it had all begun with a simple act of kindness from a cowboy who'd asked nothing in return, but had gained everything worth having. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of joy and challenge, triumph and hardship. The children grew, the ranches prospered, and Julia and Ben aged together with grace and continued devotion. They faced droughts and harsh winters, celebrated births and mourned deaths, and through it all remained each other's constant support and greatest love. When Julia was old and her hair had turned silver, she would sometimes sit on that same porch and remember the woman she'd been that desperate day when Silas Crane had come to take her home. She would think about how certain she'd been that her life was over, that she had nothing left worth saving. And she would smile, knowing that sometimes the end of one chapter was simply the beginning of something far better. Ben would find her there in those moments of reflection, and he would sit beside her without needing to ask what she was thinking about. He knew. He always knew. And they would sit together in the peaceful silence of two people who had found in each other everything they'd ever needed, watching the sun set over the land they'd built together, surrounded by the legacy of love they'd created. Their love story became something of a legend in Portland, the tale of the desperate widow and the generous cowboy who'd saved her home and won her heart. People told it to their children as an example of kindness and the redemptive power of love. But for Julia and Ben, it was simply their life, the beautiful, ordinary miracle of two souls finding each other in the vast wilderness of the world and choosing, every single day, to love and honor and cherish each other. And when they were very old and their time on earth grew short, they faced that final journey as they'd faced everything else, together and unafraid. They'd had their forever, had lived it fully and joyfully, and they'd left behind children and grandchildren who carried their legacy of love forward into the future. The ranch remained in the family for generations, passed down with stories of Julia and Ben, of how they'd met and fallen in love, of the debt paid and the love freely given. And on quiet evenings when the wind whispered through the grass and the stars shone bright overhead, some said you could still feel their presence there, the echo of a love that had transformed two separate, struggling people into something greater and more enduring than either could have been alone. It was, by any measure, a happy ending. The kind of ending Julia had stopped believing in during those dark months after Thomas's death, when she'd had nothing left to give, and the future looked impossibly bleak. But Ben had shown her that endings could become beginnings, that loss could lead to finding, and that sometimes the greatest blessings came disguised as strangers on horseback, with kind eyes and generous hearts. She had been saved, yes, but more importantly, she had learned to save herself, to stand strong and build something lasting. Ben had given her the chance, but Julia had done the work, had chosen courage over despair and hope over resignation. Together they had created something beautiful, a love story for the ages, a testament to the transformative power of kindness and the enduring strength of the human heart. And that, Julia would have said had anyone asked, was the greatest treasure of all. Not the land or the cattle or the prosperity they'd achieved, but the knowledge that she was loved and capable of loving in return, that she had worth beyond measure and strength, beyond her imagining. Ben had paid her debt that day, but in truth, they'd spent the rest of their lives paying each other back with devotion and partnership, and a love that grew deeper with each passing year. It was a debt neither ever wanted to finish repaying, a beautiful cycle of giving and receiving that sustained them through all the years of their long, happy life together. And in the end, wasn't that what love was supposed to be? Not a transaction or an obligation, but a choice made freely, every day, to give your heart to someone and trust them to treasure it as the precious gift it was. Julia and Ben had learned that lesson well, had lived it fully, and had passed it on to their children and grandchildren. And long after they were gone, their love story remained, a beacon of hope for anyone who'd ever felt lost or desperate or certain that their best days were behind them. Because Julia and Ben had proven that it was never too late for a new beginning, never too late to find love, never too late to discover that the person you'd been waiting for might ride into your life on an ordinary Tuesday and change everything forever.